My own daughter stood in my kitchen last Thursday and told me I was the reason her father left, that I was emotionally unavailable and impossible to please. 3 days later, she called me at high AM screaming that she'd been in a car accident and needed tham hung immediately or the other driver would press charges. I told her to call her father. The voicemail I received from a detective the next morning made me realize I'd been a fool for the past 9 years. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button. Let me back up and explain how a 32-year-old retired schoolteacher ended up being conned by her own flesh and blood, because this story didn't start with that phone call. It started almost a decade ago when my husband of 31 years announced he'd found his true self, and that true self apparently required a 29-year-old yoga instructor named Destiny. My name is Margaret, and I spent 31 years building a life with a man named Robert. We raised our daughter Stephanie in a comfortable home in suburban Ohio. I taught 4th grade for 31 years while Robert worked his way up to regional manager at an insurance company. We weren't rich, but we were stable. We had a retirement plan. We had a future. Then Robert turned tham and decided stability was suffocating him. The divorce was brutal but quick. Robert wanted out so badly, he agreed to let me keep the house and most of our savings. I thought I'd gotten the better end of the deal. What I didn't realize was that Robert had already spent 2 years transferring money to accounts I didn't know existed. The retirement fund I thought we had was half of what the statements showed. But the real damage wasn't financial. It was what Robert did to my relationship with our daughter. Stephanie was ba when we divorced. Fresh out of college with a degree in communications and no job prospects. She'd always been closer to her father. Robert had a way of making everything feel like an adventure, while I was the one reminding her about deadlines and responsibilities. The fun parent versus the practical parent. I'm sure many of you know exactly what I mean. After the divorce, Robert moved into a sleek apartment downtown and suddenly had money for things he'd claimed we couldn't afford during our marriage. Concert tickets, weekend trips, expensive dinners at restaurants I'd only seen on television. And Stephanie was his constant companion. Meanwhile, I was alone in our family home, trying to figure out how to live on a teacher's pension while paying off the credit card debt Robert had somehow left in my name. The manipulation started slowly. Stephanie would come home from weekends with her father full of stories about his exciting new life. Dad says you were always too focused on saving money instead of living. Dad says your expectations were unrealistic. Dad thinks you should try being more spontaneous. Each comment was a small cut. Individually, they seemed harmless. Together, they formed a pattern I was too close to see. By the time Stephanie turned 31, she'd moved back into my house after her apartment lease ended and her roommate moved away. Just for a few months, she said. Until I figure out my next steps. Those few months turned into years. Stephanie worked occasionally, temp jobs and part-time retail positions that never seemed to last more than a few weeks. She always had reasons. The manager was unreasonable. The commute was too long. The work wasn't fulfilling her potential. Robert, of course, supported her completely, from a distance. Stephanie needs time to find herself, he'd tell me during our rare phone conversations about our daughter. Not everyone follows the traditional path, Margaret. You've always been so rigid about these things. Rigid. That was Robert's favorite word for me. Rigid about money. Rigid about schedules. Rigid about expectations. Never mind that my rigidity had kept our family financially stable for 3 decades, while Robert made investments that never panned out. What I didn't know was that Robert had been coaching Stephanie for years. Every complaint she had about my rules, my expectations, my reasonable requests that she contribute to the household, Robert was there to validate her feelings and undermine my authority. Your mother means well, he'd say. But she doesn't understand that success looks different for your generation. Your mother's always been controlling about money. Don't let her make you feel guilty for needing support. Your mother never supported my dreams either. That's why I had to leave. Stephanie repeated these phrases to me like mantras. She probably didn't even realize she was quoting her father verbatim. By the time Stephanie turned 31, I'd essentially become her landlord, housekeeper, and personal ATM. She lived in my home rent-free, ate my food, used my utilities, and borrowed money she never repaid. When I suggested she contribute even a small amount to household expenses, she'd accuse me of being materialistic and remind me that her father understood the importance of emotional support over financial transactions. The irony was thick enough to choke on. Robert's emotional support consisted of weekly phone calls and monthly dinners at expensive restaurants where he'd pay for her meal while I paid for her life. Last month, everything came to a head. It started when I made the mistake of asking Stephanie to pay her own cell phone bill, $15 a month. I'd been covering it for years, and my retirement budget was getting tighter as inflation ate away at my savings. "You want me to pay for my phone?" She looked at me, like I'd asked her to donate a kidney. "Stephanie, you're muy high years old. I've been paying your phone bill since college. I think it's reasonable to ask you to take over this one expense. Dad was right about you." Her voice went cold in a way that reminded me painfully of Robert. "You've always valued money over relationships. That's why he left. That's why I've always felt closer to him than to you." The words landed like physical blows. 9 years of careful manipulation. And there it was, laid out in the open. "Stephanie, your father left because he was having an affair with his yoga instructor. That's your version. Dad says you made the marriage impossible. He says you were emotionally unavailable and impossible to please. He says he tried for years to connect with you, but you were always more interested in your budget spreadsheets than in him." I stared at my daughter and saw Robert's expressions on her face. The dismissive eye roll, the condescending half smile. He'd spent 9 years teaching her to see me exactly the way he wanted. "If your father is so supportive," I said quietly, "maybe you should go live with him." Stephanie laughed. "Dad's apartment isn't set up for long-term guests. Besides, he thinks I benefit from having stability here while I figure things out." Of course he did. Robert got to be the understanding, supportive father who took Stephanie to nice dinners and told her everything she wanted to hear. I got to be the unreasonable mother who actually dealt with the daily reality of supporting an adult child who'd never grown up. That night, Stephanie packed a bag and went to stay with Robert. "I need space from your negativity," she announced on her way out the door. She was gone for 5 days. 5 peaceful, quiet days where I rediscovered what my home felt like without the constant tension of walking on eggshells around my own daughter. Then came the phone call. At high, by a.m. on a Tuesday, my phone rang. Stephanie's name on the screen. Nobody calls at high a.m. with good news. Mom, I need help." Her voice was frantic, words tumbling over each other. "I was in a car accident, and I hit this other car. And the guy is saying his neck hurts, and he wants home or he's going to call the police and press charges, and I'm scared. Mom, I'm really scared." I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. Whatever had happened between us, Stephanie was my daughter. "Slow down. Where are you? Are you hurt?" "I'm fine. But Mom, this guy is really angry, and he says if I don't give him cash tonight, he's going to sue me for everything, and I'll go to jail, and my life will be ruined." Something about her tone felt wrong. The words were coming too fast, too rehearsed, like she was reading from a script. "Stephanie, if you were in a car accident, you need to call the police and file a report. That's how these things work." "No! The guy says if I call the police, he'll say I was drunk driving." "Mom, I had 1 glass of wine at dinner, but he'll lie and say I was wasted. Please, I just need you to send home, and this all goes away." Home, a very specific number, not around 8,000 or almost 10,000. Exactly. Home. "Stephanie, where is your father right now?" Silence on the other end. Then, "He's not answering his phone." "Your father, who you've been staying with for 5 days, isn't answering his phone at high a.m. when you've supposedly been in a car accident." "Mom, please, I can't explain everything right now. I just need you to transfer the money." I thought about the daughter who'd stood in my kitchen a week ago telling me I was emotionally unavailable and impossible to please. I thought about 9 years of being the villain in Robert's carefully constructed narrative. I thought about home, which represented months of my retirement savings. "Stephanie, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to hang up and call your father myself. If you've really been in an accident, he should know about it." Mom, no, don't call Dad. He'll be upset that I borrowed his car. His car. So Robert's car was involved in this supposed accident, but Robert wasn't answering his phone and didn't know about it. Stephanie, I love you, but I'm not sending them home at high AM based on a story that doesn't add up. Call your father. Figure this out with him. He's the supportive parent, remember? Let him support you. I hung up before she could respond. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. From the realization that I'd finally stopped being manipulated. I turned off my phone and went back to sleep. The next morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls from Stephanie, several frantic text messages, and one voicemail from a number I didn't recognize with a Sao Chum-Murbone area code. Mrs. Patterson, this is Detective Williams from the Columbus Police Department. We'd like to speak with you regarding your daughter Stephanie Patterson and an ongoing investigation. Please call us back at your earliest convenience. My blood ran cold. Had something really happened to Stephanie? Had my refusal to send money put her in danger? I called the number immediately. Detective Williams speaking. This is Margaret Patterson. You left me a message about my daughter. Yes, ma'am. Thank you for calling back. I need to ask you some questions about a phone call you received early this morning. Is my daughter okay? Your daughter is fine, Mrs. Patterson. She's actually here at the station with us right now. But I need to know, did she ask you for them last night claiming she'd been in a car accident? Yes. How did you know that? Because there was no car accident, Mrs. Patterson. Your daughter was part of an attempted fraud scheme, and you're not the only victim who was targeted last night. The detective explained that my phone call to Robert after hanging up on Stephanie had inadvertently blown the whole thing open. Robert, apparently panicking that his scheme was unraveling, had called Stephanie and told her to abort the plan, but he'd used a phone that was already being monitored as part of a larger investigation into financial fraud targeting seniors. Robert, it turned out, had been running variations of this scam for years. He'd target recently divorced or widowed women through dating apps and social connections, build relationships with them, then use manufactured emergencies to extract money. The car accident scheme was one of his favorites. What made my situation unique was that Robert had recruited our own daughter to help him. Mrs. Patterson, we believe your ex-husband has been grooming your daughter for years to assist in his fraud operations. The money she's been borrowing from you over the past several years may have been going directly to him. I felt like the floor was tilting. What do you mean? We have evidence that your daughter has been transferring significant portions of any money she receives to accounts controlled by your ex-husband. The requests for money for rent deposits or car repairs or emergency expenses, did those ever actually go to those purposes? I thought about all the time Stephanie had needed money for things that never materialized. The car that never got fixed. The apartment deposit for a place she never moved into. The investment opportunity that disappeared without explanation. Oh my God. Mrs. Patterson, we'd like you to come down to the station. Your daughter is asking to speak with you, and we have some questions about your ex-husband's financial activities during your marriage. I drove to the police station in a daze. 9 years. 9 years of believing Robert had simply found his true self and left me for a younger woman. 9 years of watching my daughter choose him over me without understanding why. 9 years of being painted as the rigid, materialistic, emotionally unavailable mother, while Robert systematically turned my own child into his accomplice. At the station, a young detective led me to an interview room where Stephanie sat at a metal table, her face streaked with tears. She looked up when I walked in, and for the first time in years, I saw my little girl instead of the stranger she'd become. Mom, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know what Dad was really doing. I sat down across from her, keeping my voice steady. Tell me everything. The story that emerged over the next 2 hours was worse than I'd imagined. Robert's departure from our marriage hadn't been a midlife crisis. It had been a calculated exit strategy. He'd been running financial scams for years, using his position at the insurance company to identify vulnerable targets. When internal investigators started getting close, he'd engineered the divorce to protect assets he'd already hidden and to establish himself as a sympathetic single father who'd escaped a difficult marriage. Stephanie had been his unwitting accomplice from the beginning. Robert had convinced her that I was hoarding money that should have been split equally in the divorce. He'd told her that the loans she was getting from me were really just her claiming her fair share of marital assets I'd stolen from him. Dad said you had money hidden in accounts I didn't know about, Stephanie sobbed. He said you'd manipulated the divorce settlement to leave him with nothing. He said every time I got money from you, I was really just getting what was rightfully his. And you believed him? He showed me documents, Mom. Bank statements with your name on them, showing hundreds of thousands of dollars. He said you'd been hiding money for years. Forged documents. Of course. Robert had always been good with paperwork. Stephanie, I'm a retired schoolteacher. Where exactly did your father think I was hiding hundreds of thousands of dollars? Her face crumpled. I don't know. It made sense when he explained it. Everything always made sense when Dad explained it. That was Robert's true talent. Making nonsense sound perfectly reasonable. The dam. Come last night. Whose idea was that? Dad's. He said you'd been holding out on me, that you had an emergency fund you'd never touched. He said if I called with a real emergency, you'd have to use it. He said once we had that money, he could invest it and double it within 6 months, and then he'd give me my share. And you believed him? Stephanie looked at me with eyes that finally seemed to see clearly. Mom, I've believed everything Dad told me for 9 years. He made me think you were the enemy. He made me think every time you asked me to be responsible, you were being controlling. Every time you suggested I get a job, you were trying to crush my spirit. Every time you asked for basic respect, you were being materialistic and cold. She took a shaky breath. But you know what Dad never did? He never actually helped me. He never gave me a place to live. He never paid my bills. He never sat with me when I was sick or helped me figure out my life. He just told me what I wanted to hear and pointed me back at you. The detective returned with coffee and more questions. Over the next several hours, I learned the full scope of Robert's operation. He'd been targeting vulnerable women for at least a decade, using a network of accomplices, including his girlfriend Destiny, who turned out to be his business partner rather than his romantic partner. The yoga instructor story had been cover for their actual relationship, which was purely financial. Destiny recruited targets through wellness communities and social groups. Robert built the relationships and executed the scams, and a team of others handled the technical aspects of forged documents and account manipulation. Stephanie had been their latest recruit. Robert had spent years conditioning her to distrust me and depend on him emotionally while depending on me financially. When he needed someone to make the emergency call that would trigger my maternal instincts and bypass my common sense, Stephanie was the obvious choice. Your daughter is technically an accomplice to attempted fraud, Detective Williams told me privately. But given the evidence of long-term psychological manipulation and her cooperation with our investigation, the DA is willing to consider alternatives to prosecution. What kind of alternatives? Testimony against her father. Full disclosure of every financial transaction she was involved in. Cooperation with forensic accountants to trace where the money went. And mandatory counseling for victims of financial grooming. Financial grooming? It's a term we use for situations like this. Your ex-husband spent years grooming your daughter to participate in his schemes, the same way predators groom victims for other types of abuse. He isolated her from you emotionally, made her dependent on his approval, and gradually normalized unethical behavior. I thought about all the times Stephanie had defended her father against evidence right in front of her face. All the times she'd dismissed my concerns as jealousy or bitterness. All the times she'd chosen his comfortable lies over my uncomfortable truths. What happens to Robert? We've got enough to charge him with multiple counts of wire fraud, elder financial abuse, and conspiracy. If your daughter testifies, we can add charges related to using a family member in a fraud scheme. He's looking at federal prison time. Federal prison. The man I'd been married to for bamwi-bone years, the father of my child, was facing federal prison for systematically defrauding people, including his own family. Mrs. Patterson, there's something else you should know. Detective Williams pulled out a folder. During our investigation, we discovered that your ex-husband has been monitoring your financial accounts for years. He had access to your online banking through security questions your daughter answered for him. What? Every time you checked your balance, Every deposit, every withdrawal, he could see it all. He knew exactly how much money you had at any given time. The home request last night wasn't random. He knew that was approximately what you had in your emergency savings. I felt violated in a way I couldn't fully articulate. Robert hadn't just manipulated my emotions and poisoned my relationship with my daughter. He'd been watching my finances like a predator watching prey, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Stephanie was released to my custody that evening with strict conditions. No contact with her father. No access to her own bank accounts until the investigation was complete. Regular check-ins with a victim's advocate. The drive home was silent until we were almost to the house. Then Stephanie spoke. "Mom, I understand if you don't want me living with you anymore." I pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine before responding. "Stephanie, you've spent 9 years treating me like an inconvenience while worshiping a man who was using you as a tool to steal from people. You told me last week that I was emotionally unavailable and impossible to please. You've never once, in the past 9 years, acknowledged that I was the one actually supporting you while your father took credit for being understanding." She started to cry again. I know. And I'm so sorry. I'm not finished." I turned to face her directly. "You're going to live here because you have nowhere else to go and because despite everything you're my daughter. But things are going to be different." "Different how?" "You're going to get a job. A real job. Not a temporary position you quit after 2 weeks because it's not fulfilling. You're going to contribute to this household. You're going to go to the counseling the court is requiring and actually do the work. And you're never going to tell me again that your father was the supportive parent while I was the unreasonable one. Mom, I swear, I'll do whatever you want. I'll get a job this week. I'll pay rent. I'll do all the counseling. I need you to understand that I really didn't know what Dad was doing. I thought I was helping him get money that was rightfully his. I thought you were the one who'd been unfair. I know. And I did know. Robert had been manipulating me for bon years. He'd had much longer to work on Stephanie. That's why you're going to counseling. Because you need to understand how someone who claimed to love you used that love to turn you into a criminal." We went inside. I made tea. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd told me I was impossible to please. But this time, the power dynamic had shifted completely. "Mom, can I ask you something?" "Yes. When I called last night with that story about the accident, how did you know it wasn't real?" I thought about it. Several things. The specific dollar amount. The pressure to send money immediately without involving police. The fact that your father supposedly wasn't answering his phone, but mostly, it was because you've spent years telling me how unsupportive and uncaring I am. If I was really as terrible as you and your father claimed, why would you call me for help in an emergency? Stephanie's face crumpled with fresh understanding. Because you were never terrible. You were the one who was actually there. Yes. And your father knew that. He counted on it. He knew that no matter how much you'd pushed me away, I would still answer when you called. He was planning to exploit my love for you to steal my money. The next few months were complicated. Robert was arrested 2 weeks later, caught trying to flee to Mexico with Destiny and nearly hung in stolen funds. The trial made local news. Stephanie testified against her father, describing in painful detail the years of manipulation he'd used to turn her against me. I sat in the courtroom and watched the man I'd married transform in front of the jury from a charming businessman into something much darker. Without his audience of admirers, without his carefully constructed narrative, Robert looked exactly like what he was. A predator who'd used everyone around him, including his own child. He was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. Destiny got 8. Several other accomplices received varying sentences. After the trial, Stephanie and I walked out of the courthouse together. She'd gotten a job as an administrative assistant at a nonprofit that helped fraud victims. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. "Mom, I know it's going to take years to make up for how I treated you. Yes, it will. But I want you to know that I understand now. I understand what Dad did and why. I understand how he used my love for him to hurt you. And I understand that you were the real parent all along, even when I couldn't see it." I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, and saw someone I hadn't seen in 9 years. Not the entitled young woman Robert had shaped her into, but the little girl who used to curl up beside me on the couch while I graded papers. The teenager who'd come to me first when her heart got broken. The person she might have been if her father hadn't spent a decade poisoning her mind. Stephanie, I love you. I've always loved you, even when you were making it very hard. But love isn't just feelings, it's actions. It's showing up every day even when it's difficult. It's telling someone hard truths instead of comfortable lies. I know that now. Good. Because that's the kind of love I'm going to need from you going forward. Not gratitude, not apologies. Just consistent, daily effort to be the person you're capable of being. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I can do that. I will do that. We drove home in comfortable silence. Stephanie started dinner while I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, thinking about everything that had happened. Robert had spent 9 years trying to destroy my relationship with my daughter so he could use her to steal from me. Instead, his scheme had been exposed. He was facing over a decade in prison, and Stephanie and I were closer than we'd been since before the divorce. There's a certain justice in that. Not the dramatic, movie-style justice where the villain gets what's coming in a satisfying climax. Real justice is quieter. It's the moment when the lies finally stop working and the truth becomes impossible to ignore. Stephanie came out onto the porch and sat down beside me. Mom, I have something to tell you. What is it? I've been thinking about going back to school, getting a real degree, maybe in social work. I want to help other people who've been through what we went through. I looked at my daughter, at the woman she was finally becoming at Bamwi High, and felt something I hadn't felt in 9 years. Hope. I think that's a wonderful idea. She leaned her head on my shoulder, something she hadn't done since she was a teenager. Thanks, Mom, for not giving up on me. Even when I gave you every reason to. You're my daughter. Giving up on you was never an option. And that, I think, is the real difference between Robert and me. He saw everyone, even his own child, as tools to be used and discarded. I saw my daughter as someone worth fighting for, even when she couldn't see it herself. Robert's manipulations failed because he underestimated the one thing he'd never understood: what real love actually looks like. It's not telling people what they want to hear. It's not making them feel good about bad choices. It's showing up, day after day, and doing the hard work of caring, even when it's not appreciated. That's the lesson I hope Stephanie carries forward. And that's the story I needed to tell. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.